Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage MethodSpace, and I'm pleased to be joined today by Giuseppe Veltri, who is the author of a new book about designing online experiments for the social sciences. But before we get started, if you are new to MethodSpace, this is a blog community sponsored by Sage Publishing that is a place where you can learn about all different kinds of research, design, planning, analyzing, writing about it, and sharing results in a variety of ways. You can see at the heart of this diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think whether you are a brand new researcher or a very experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And that's why I enjoy having these opportunities for a conversation, because I think especially as we look at how to do research in our changing world, we need to keep learning. So why don't you just begin by introducing yourself?
Okay, thank you, Janet. So my name is Giuseppe Veltri. I'm a professor in computational social science and cognitive sociology at the Department of Sociology and Social Research at the University of Trento in Italy. I've been working in many academic systems, including UK, France, Spain, and I always had a particular interest in research methods.
So why don't you begin by defining what you mean by online experiments and tell us a little bit about why someone might choose to do an online experiment rather than, other types of data collection?
Well, it all started when I developed an interest into digital methods. As you rightly pointed out, now there is a lot of different digital methods that people can use and collect data. But at the same time, in the social sciences, I'm in the sociology department, the use of experiments started to become more and more popular, leaving what were traditional areas where people would run experiments, like in psychology, for example. And the reason for that was that to carry out experiments online started to become easier. Now, the online experiments, they have a big advantage in terms of what they can provide in terms of a typical critique that other social sciences used to make to lab experiments. So the biggest problem was that you could only run experiments with a small amount of people, with usually a set of participants that they were either not representative in statistical sense, or they were, as I guess the famous expression now goes, weird. So from just specific countries. And so that, the use of experiment always troubled social scientists, that they wanted to take in consideration the heterogeneity and diversity that we find in human populations. Now, the advantage of online experiments is that you can provide an answer to that, because you can combine everything we have learned from web surveys, so to build representative samples and combine that with running an experiment online. So what we do is essentially take the experiment out of the lab, and we are able to deploy the experiment on a large representative sample of people, which can be very large, can be across different countries. And that makes our experiments particularly externally valid in terms of increasing their capacity of describing something that would happen in a general population beyond the few people that we can master in a lab. I would add also that many experiments that happen in the lab these days are done on PCs, on computer screens anyway. So most of the tasks that people do in lab experiments are actually easy to reproduce on anybody's laptop or anybody's PC. And of course, there's only, let's say, a subset of experiments. There are experiments that might require some kind of physical dimension of manipulation or touch. Obviously, we cannot do that.
Right.
There might be some proxies. There can be some substitute of that kind of task, but there is, however, a portion of experiments that we can reproduce online as they were designed in the lab. So combining a larger pool of respondents, which can be representative of whatever population we're studying, together with all the advantages of doing online research, no geographical boundaries, faster data collection, and so on. All these together comes to online experiments.
So could you give us an example or discuss what kinds of problems might be best studied with online experiments?
So I guess the biggest area of application is really when you want to study, for example, decision-making processes. So you want to do experiments to understand how people choose between different options, or they evaluate information, or they might be subject to I don't know, particular social norms in order to share or not information. So everything that has to do with decision-making usually is fairly straightforward to implement online. Of course, it depends obviously on the resources of the researcher. You can simulate things, or you can actually implement it in a kind of real life settings. There are, of course, a set of experiments that now people do also online that concerns more I would say, the psychology side, where they study memory or perception or this sort of things. But for, I would say, sociology, political science, and all the kind of sister disciplines, so to speak, you can run experiments about people essentially evaluating information or deciding things, or so collecting also some kind of a behavioral data in terms of doing something online. Okay. And I think that is also an advantage compared to traditional web surveys, where you would just normally collect self-reported information, and you wouldn't have a dimension where people actually do something online.
But I can certainly see the value of that, because I think, we consider, not only surveys, but also interviews that both are relying on questioning. You are expecting the participant to recall their experience with whatever you're discussing. And also, they're going to filter that a little bit towards, well, if I tell you what I really thought or what I really did, you're going to think, I'm crazy or a bad person, or, something, you may have some judgment about me. So, or if I tell it this way, I'm going to look better. There inevitably, a little bit of that. So creating some kind of situation where people need to respond, I think, that does have a unique value, or an important value to consider. So tell us a little bit, like, what would the design steps be? Where would someone start when thinking about doing an online experiment?
So normally it gets the beginning very close to how you design experiments by itself. But then, of course, there are some specific steps that they are very important for online experiments. So if we want to do an experiment that can really exploit this possibility of being deployed on a large scale, the first thing is really the construction of the sample that we want to use. And the second is normally the programming part, in terms of the type of task that we ask people to do online in an online settings. For example, if you do a choice experiment where people have to choose between different options. That means to program and organize how people will see things on the screen and what will happen when they choose one option over the other, what information you record, what level of details really you want to record. And in that respect, we learn from the web survey tradition in terms of how important can be metadata and paradata, so data about the process, and that it can enrich really beyond the data itself we are collecting, enrich our analysis. And so that is, let's say, the typical step, I would say. Then what you have is an aspect of design online, which you have to take into consideration. So the, if you will, affordances that having something online might produce. For example, it's very important to know if people that will respond to your online experiments will use a small screen or a big screen. If they respond, what kind of device they use, because if you're showing pictures or something that requires high definition, it clearly matters if they respond on a laptop screen or a mobile phone screen. And so there are all these details about the interface, essentially, that you have to take in consideration. And again, here, we don't need to reinvent the wheel in the sense that you have a lot of tradition in human-machine interaction literature that can really teach you about the colors, about the graphical elements of the platform. Again, people have discussed this in the web survey context, but not so much in the experimental settings. So I would say these are the main steps. Then, of course, there are some issues concerning privacy and the data protection that these days are really important. So you have to take in consideration what kind of data you're collecting. If you are in the domain of potentially sensitive data or personal data, how you can avoid that. And so try to have a strategy if you collect sensitive data, how these data will be managed and then stored. So all these aspects became essentially a combination of designing stages of a normal experiment, but also then a web survey and some specific features that they are unique to online experiments.
Yeah, I think, having written about online methodology, one of the differences between doing something face-to-face, if you're in a face-to-face experimental situation, we know that part of the research ethics involves the voluntary nature, and that, you could say, I'm done, I'm going to get up and leave the room. But there's a certain amount of it takes some guts to do that. Whereas when you're online, all they have to do is click that little X in the corner and they're gone. So, trying to think in terms of say with the decision making, as you described, how much information to provide? Are people going to go this is going to take too much time, I'm out of here? Or how do you engage them, to keep them to complete the entire experiment? I'm sure that there are aspects like that would be unique to the online experiment.
Yes, indeed. It's absolutely true that in online experiment, it's easier to drop out, and this is also something that you cannot avoid, in the sense that it has to be part of your design. As from a research ethics perspective, people need to be free to drop out at any time, because if they are exposed to any what they might consider uncomfortable material, they should be able to just drop out at any time. But of course, from a researcher point of view, it means that you need to find a kind of balance between that kind of freedom, but also motivate them and have enough interest so that they complete the experiment. Now, there is no magic solution for that, I guess, in the sense that often the main driver is the topic itself.
Mhm.
Of course, what you should know is that you need to calibrate very well the cognitive load that you're imposing on people, because one big difference between a lab experiment and an online experiment is that in a lab experiment you have usually full control about the settings in which the experiment takes place. So you can make sure people are not distracted, they are not
Right.
but in the case of online, they are in the comfort of their own, but also subject to
Right.
potential distractions. So an online experiment task cannot be as burden as you might do in a lab experiment. So lab experiments, I've seen experiments lasting an hour. That's simply impossible online. So that is something you have to take in consideration. So calibrate well the cognitive load. Then there is an additional, let's say, topic, which is if you want to employ or not incentives for participation. And these incentives can be performance-based, meaning that only people that complete the full scale of the experiment, or even if they perform well in whatever task you're doing, they receive such incentives. This is a bit of a debate because for people coming from economics, for example, absolutely they want incentives. For them is crucial. You should have incentive, because this is something that somehow, in their eyes, guarantees the fact that people will make an effort to do the experiment well. In other social sciences, there's a more mixed view in the sense that not always incentives are used. Sometimes it's possible that they're not needed. They might be incentives also in different forms. I mean, usually when we talk about incentives, usually we mean some kind of small monetary token that people might receive, but it could be other forms of incentives. So there are different, let's say, strategies that you can employ in order to avoid that people will drop out or lose interest.
So in your book, you cover a wide range of options, and you differentiate between obtrusive and unobtrusive, and you talk about laboratory, field, and natural experiments. Could you just briefly kind of dig into those a little bit?
Yes. So the lab experiments, let's start from the distinction of experiments. So lab experiments are, as the name suggests, experiments that usually happen in a lab. They normally have high internal validity, meaning they're very good at measuring what they have to measure, because usually you control the environment and you can make sure that people are not distracted, or there are some external factors that confound what you're trying to measure during your experiment. But they tend to have low external validity because these experiments are usually run with small numbers of individuals, often self-selected based on voluntary participation or a mechanism similar to that. Field experiments are experiments where you basically run the experiments in the natural settings, so to speak, in the environment where people live. So they don't have to be online. I mean, field experiments can be obviously offline, but field experiments offline are actually quite difficult to organize. I mean, usually they require a lot of resources. And of course, field experiments, they have the problem that you cannot control the environment of what's going on in let's say, natural settings. And therefore, they add a layer of complication. But field experiments are employed by, for example, international organizations when they want to test a new policy, let's say a health policy in whatever set of villages in whatever country. They might do a field experiments to test that. And then we have natural experiments. Natural experiments are a situation where basically we take an event that happened and changed things And we use that as an experiment in order to, so it's not an experiment in the strict sense of having, let's say, an experimental and a control group in a traditional sense, but we have a group that's been exposed to whatever event that becomes our treatment. And then we take another group that somehow we think they have not been affected by the same event, and that becomes our control group. And we use that as basically we measure these two populations on whatever scales or measurements we're using. And so we use that, let's say, natural scenario as an experiment. This is very common, let's say, in also natural sciences, I would say, and some part of economics and say kind of policy-related research. Online experiments are a bit in a sort of hybrid form, because in fact, I consider online experiments a bit like field experiments, in the sense that we go out of the lab, we are in the field, in the sense that today the digital is part of our life for everyone. Of course, it might vary across countries. It might not be the same in all continents, but overall, the digital now is part of our life. So I consider online experiments as some kind of a specific case of field experiments. So there was the other aspect about obtrusive, unobtrusive. So that distinction is really about how much participants are aware of the fact that you are collecting data, essentially. And there are other digital methods, I would say specifically in the recent past, that they were much more oriented towards the unobtrusive methods, meaning that you could go and collect data of people's Twitter account or whatever social media platform, and then run analysis. Usually you would run analysis at a kind of aggregate level, but still people would not know that a researcher was using their data in doing research. Now things have changed because of regulations. It's much more difficult to do that kind of process. But online experiments are, in this case, unobtrusive, because obviously they require the engagement of individuals. So people will know that you are measuring because they participate with the experiments. However, even in that scenario, there might be some levels of unawareness of the fact that you are, for example, recording the time it takes for them to answer or doing some task, because that kind of metadata or paradata usually are not explicitly described, because they see only the task that obviously is put in front of them.
So, thinking about your book and our MethodSpace readers, talk a little bit about how, to describe the book itself and how it might be used, because it would seem to me that this would be valuable way beyond the classroom, that, while, people who are in a methods class right now, or someone who's teaching a methods class, yes, would certainly be a valuable component. But it would seem to me that it would also have a real, professional value for people who already are, experienced researchers in more conventional or traditional methods, and are now looking at, what else could I do, given, as you say, it's not only a matter of the tools now being available, it's just the way that we live is different, and the field, our lifestyles are, for most of us today, in some kind of a hybrid form between our in real life and our digital lives that are intertwined.
Absolutely. I think my main goal when I wrote this book was to put in one place the experience I accumulated in the past few years in doing online experiments. And there is a number of lessons that you learn when you do experiments, including mistakes, that often are just not described by anyone, or they're not really clear. until you do the kind of mistakes or you learn certain lessons. So there is a part of the book that has a lot of kind of practical suggestions how to run this type of research that really comes out of experience. And then, of course, there is also a more, I would say, academic or kind of theoretically driven discussion about the design of experiments and all let's say, the more formal aspects of designing experiments. But one additional, I think, valuable contribution of my book is that I also consider how the data that you produce out of these online experiments, which tend to be very rich, because again, we are measuring whatever experimental task on a large sample that sometimes can easily be in the tens of thousands of people across different countries or continents. So given that you have that kind of rich data, how you analyze those data? And I discuss the advances in computational social science methods that can be used for that purpose. And in particular, in the context of experiment, how you can use new techniques that have been developed in order to identify heterogeneity or treatment effects, which in this case became a very valuable source of information, because once you run an experiment on a very large set of participants, which usually are representative samples, you can start to identify important differences in the way how people either react to a treatment or an intervention, or if it's more an experiment about mapping mechanism or determinants of choice, how much variation there is, how much heterogeneity you might find. And I think the combination of these computational methods together with the power of data collection that online experiments can provide is huge. And the last point I mentioned is a bit opening to the future, is that more and more some of our device includes also sensor data. This sensor data can be combined with the data that we might collect in our online experiments. So, for example, if we answer or participate into an online experiment using our mobile phone have all set of sensors about our location, about the humidity in the air around us, or a number of other information that might be useful in addition to what we collect. So we are expanding a lot our capacity of data collection, but we're also thinking about new analytical strategies, how to make the best out of this very rich and multidimensional data.
I think you make an important point about being able to use a book like this, to share lessons learned, because that's not something that we can get from research articles. So we might read an article where someone collected their data using an online experiment, but usually in a research article it will look like, oh, everything was absolutely smooth sailing. There were no wrinkles here, so new researchers, really need that sort of candid advice about, what to look out for. And, and especially the commitment and the resources, et cetera, that go into doing this kind of research. You want to be able to benefit from the experience that others have had. You don't want to waste your time or the participants' time.
Absolutely. I mean, everybody who has been doing research knows that there are always trade-offs, and there is a lot of unsaid decisions that you have to at one point take. And when you publish an article, everything, all this is in the background, and you just publish the polished outcome of your research. But usually it's a long way to get there. and I think that, a book provides a kind of blueprint to do that.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us about your book and about this really exciting, I think, advance in online research.
Thank you, and thank you for having me.